Hello. Thanks for watching my last couple videos. Conservatism and art have a complicated relationship. The issue is that so much of the art that we find memorable is memorable because, in some way, big or small, it asks us to think differently about the status quo. Let's take something like Parasite, for example. It's a movie that took the low boiling anxieties of wealth divide and extrapolated them into what I can only describe as class horror, all the while offering a nuanced commentary on the way capitalism breeds both opportunism and crime within the proletariat, as well as an obscene kind of blissful ignorance in the bourgeoisie. But again, the kind of subversion I'm getting at doesn't need to be that big and conceptual. For example, consider a film like Tucker and Dale vs. Evil, a horror comedy whose main conceit is that it inverts our expectations of a slasher film by positioning the stereotypical backwoods hillbillies as the sympathetic protagonists, and the college-aged frat boy campers as the true villains. Overall, what I'm trying to get at here is that art, not always, but often, asks us for our openness, and in exchange, offers us a new lens through which to see the world, or at least some part of it. Conservatism, on the other hand, desires the reaffirmation of traditional ways of seeing the world. I don't mean to say here that any individual conservative is incapable of making good art. What I'm trying to say is that art made from a right-leaning perspective will always have trouble feeling truly new or innovative, because it must rest on the belief that traditional perspectives are innately superior. So, where am I going with this? Well, in this video, I want to talk about a movie that came out a couple years ago now. A piece of conservative art. I'm talking about Run, Hide, Fight. A film written and directed by celebrated alt overlooker and widely panned filmmaker Kyle Rankin, and distributed by God of Stinky Boys himself, Ben Shapiro. And sorry to disappoint, but I'm not going to be going too deep into the life and times of Ben Shapiro in this video. I mean, I trust that you know who he is.
Here we are at Home Depot. As you know, controversy has now engulfed Home Depot because Home Depot is not getting involved in Georgia's voter law controversy. You should be buying from companies that are not falling to the woke left. So here's what we're doing. We're gonna go in there, I'm gonna buy some stuff, and then I'm gonna leave. All right, as you can see, I just went shopping at Home Depot. You should do the same. This wood, this board, this magnificent piece of poplar is now mine.
So, when Run, Hide, Fight came out back in 2020, I knew I eventually had to watch it, but I had absolutely zero interest in subscribing to the Daily Wire's proprietary streaming service, so I just kind of forgot about it for a couple years. Until about a week ago, when a thought popped into my head. And that thought was as follows. Whatever happened to that Ben Shapiro movie? So I decided to finally seek it out, but it's only streaming on the Daily Wire's streaming service. So I downloaded a VPN with a free trial, set it to somewhere in Austria, and then I went to a movie and it was in some very weird file format. Then, with the totally legally obtained file in my downloads folder, I booted up VLC Media Player, hit play, and watched it. And surprise, surprise, it's very bad. Okay, so let me try to be at least a little bit measured in my criticism here. I'll start off by listing a couple good things about the film. Alright, 1. It's shot and lit pretty competently. And the lead actor is pretty okay. And I also guess this character is kind of likable. And that's it. That's everything that's even a little bit redeemable about this movie. Yeah, this movie is pretty aggressively bad. The characters are all painfully stock. The writing oscillates wildly between cringe and absurdly insensitive in the context of the film. And the story regularly takes massive liberties in the realism department. On top of that, it is unsurprisingly a morally bankrupt, hacky attempt at right-wing propaganda. But even at that, it ultimately fails to be coherent really at all. I mean, the movie as a whole feels like it's desperately trying to push some kind of message. But simultaneously, I get the sense that this Rankin dude has absolutely fuck all to say about anything, beyond guns good, liberal government bad. But does any of that really surprise you? I mean, I could sit here and yammer on about how generally absurd and terrible this movie is until I'm blue in the face. But to what end? It's a Daily Wire movie. Of course it's bad. So, in an effort to hopefully offer some slightly more unique insight on the movie, I'm gonna narrow my focus a bit. Specifically, I'm gonna focus on how Run, Hide, Fight confronts mental health in its characters, both in how it depicts mental illness and trauma, as well as the prescriptive claims the movie seems to make about how a good person deals with those things. I want to zero in on this in particular because I think these elements of the film offer us a very telling window into how the American right approaches these topics more generally, especially in the wake of mass violence events. I'm realizing now that I haven't yet explained the movie's story at all. And I can't really just trust that you've all seen it because, like I said, it's 2 years old and also a commercial failure and also not streaming anywhere. Basically, this girl, Zoe Hull, is a melancholic, emotionally detached high school senior. We watch her go about her day in school, which mostly consists of teachers and friends lamenting how melancholic and emotionally detached she is. Then, during lunch, a van plows through the cafeteria windows, and a crew of school hop out. They proceed to hold the cafeteria's occupants hostage, but Zoe is able to escape into an air vent. From there, she single-handedly evacuates a bunch of people, and with the help of her dad, is able to kill all the bad guys and save the day. At least, sort of. I mean, a bunch of kids still died, but Zoe gets to be a hero and say some hero-y quips, and it's all at least presented to us as a victory of sorts. Within this harrowing course of events, the film understandably spends a lot of time exploring the mental well-being of its characters. This, of course, makes sense. After all, mass violence events inherently result in mass trauma, and the assailants themselves in these attacks often have histories of mental illness. The problem here is that the film exhibits next to no understanding of mental health, and the results of that ignorance range from absurd to harmful. In particular, the film is separately interested in the mental health of Zoe and the mental health of the assailants, and it portrays these characters and their struggles in very different ways. Let's start out with our protagonist. The film opens with a scene in which Zoe is hunting with her father, Todd. She shoots a deer, but it doesn't die right away, and lays gasping and bleeding on the ground. Todd starts going into a speech about how they have to put it out of its misery, saying that it's a tough fact of life, but it must be done. But before he can finish his speech, Zoe, without hesitation, picks up a rock and uses it to finish off the animal, which is pretty shocking and callous. I mean, even Todd looks pretty freaked out by how cold this moment was. And here, the film is showing us, from the outset, that Zoe is emotionally hardened, and to a degree that the people around her are noticing. This fact is reiterated a few times throughout the film, mostly in the form of other characters directly telling her that she's distant and emotionally closed off. Importantly, because of these conversations, we're led to understand this closed-offness as a bad thing that is negatively affecting her relationships. Eventually, we learn that this detachment is due to her mother's recent passing from cancer. This might be a good time to mention that her mother's ghost appears to her multiple times in the film. She essentially coaches Zoe through the school whilst also repeatedly encouraging her daughter to let go of her and move on with her life. The key point I want to establish here for the sake of this video is that by the second act, we understand Zoe as someone who has recently experienced trauma, is currently unable to cope with it, and is becoming emotionally detached because of it. With the right writer, coming at this script with even a passing understanding of mental health, or even just a shred of empathy, this plot could work and could offer some insight into the harsh reality of experiencing repeated trauma. But it doesn't do that. In fact, by the end, the film all but endorses the suppression of emotion in the aftermath of trauma. It basically just tells us that being callous and unfeeling is a healthy way of coping, or at least an effective one. During the attack, Zoe, guided by her ghost mom, runs around the school, telling people there's a shooting happening, and trying to evacuate them. All in all, this chunk of the movie is really not concerned with much other than making Zoe out to be a grizzled action movie badass. And that ultimately feels really, really off when you remember that this is a movie about a school It also feels weird in light of the internal struggle that the film has set up for Zoe. I mean, this is a person who is already struggling emotionally. And naturally, when we see her put through more trauma, we expect that to be treated as the horrific tragedy that we know it is. But the movie just doesn't seem to give it that kind of weight. In fact, the movie positions Zoe's badassery as a form of emotional healing in and of itself. It pays very little attention to the emotional weight of Zoe witnessing this horrific event, and how that might compound with her existing trauma regarding her mother's death. Instead, it opts to treat the attack as an opportunity for Zoe to improve her sense of self-efficacy, I guess, and in turn to seize back some control in her life, which, to me, seems like a theme that I could gloss over in a Die Hard movie, but one that sticks out like a sore thumb in a movie about a school shooting. After she's killed all the bad guys, the cops, who've been standing in the parking lot for half the movie, finally roll in and zip tie Zoe's hands. Don't worry, they eventually let her go and give her a pat on the back for doing their job for them. As Zoe lays on the ground, her mother appears to her one last time. She tells her basically that she can't hang around anymore, and is heading off into the afterlife, or the ether, or whatever. And Zoe is left sobbing uncontrollably on the ground. Her mom's ghost just kind of up and leaves, seemingly whether she likes it or not. And what? I feel like the scene is being presented to us as evidence of some kind of growth. Like, I think it's trying to show Zoe moving on from the pain of her mother's death, or at least learning to cope with it. But the movie has given us absolutely no reason to believe that this character development has actually happened. I mean, when I, as a sort of normal guy, saw her smash a deer's head in an hour ago, I kind of expected that over the course of the film, she'd have to learn to be vulnerable again. That she'd have to learn to open up and reconnect with the people in her life. And that through that compassion and empathy, she would be able to make peace with her mother's passing. But the only significant thing that's happened between her killing that deer and now is her doing more killing, and ostensibly sustaining more trauma. I guess it was a mistake to assume that the film had ever characterized her callousness as a bad thing. Also, when her mom walks away in this scene, it 100% does not feel like Zoe is moving on. It feels like she is losing her mom again, and is again not ready for it. Up until this point, we've been led to believe that this apparition of her mother is a result of Zoe being emotionally stuck on her death, and therefore could only be resolved through Zoe choosing to let go and be at peace. But again, the events of this scene don't feel emotionally like Zoe is finding peace or exercising agency at all. It's ultimately just a deeply weird moment. Like, it feels like our protagonist is at a peak of raw emotional damage, and the movie is just pretending that this is a moment of growth and healing because it has absolutely no idea what else to do. And all of this is further punctuated by the film's closing scene. While out in the parking lot immediately after the shooting, Zoe notices one of the attackers fleeing into the woods. She grabs her dad's sniper rifle, which is easily accessible to her for other dumb reasons, and takes off after him. She tracks him through the woods for a bit and shoots him. Then, as he lies on the ground, half dead, she bashes his head in with a rock in a reenactment of the film's opening scene. And then the movie just ends. And, I mean, maybe I'm missing something here. Is it uncharitable for me to read this as an affirmation of her callousness? The same callousness that the deer scene at the start of the film seemed to imply was a bad thing? But honestly, I do think that is how the film wants to be read. I think that the way we're supposed to read this scene is that Zoe, finally, when faced with the scared, dying face of a murderer, puts him down without hesitation, thus reaffirming her detachment as ultimately a point of strength rather than an unhealthy coping mechanism. And that's just really, really inaccurate. I mean, there is a reason that the whole PTSD-addled Vietnam vet trope exists, right? There's a reason suicide is the second leading cause of death in the military. All of this to say that trauma is very serious and has the potential to cause extensive, long-term damage. Heroism, no matter how badass, doesn't fix trauma. Beating the bad guy doesn't necessarily lead to emotional healing. I have a bit more to say about this, but I want to talk about the other side of this coin first. The bad guys. So, the bad guy crew in this movie is comprised of 4 people. The leader, Tristan, the stereotypically volatile schizophrenic dude, Chris, his sister, Anna, and the stereotypically volatile schizophrenic dude, Kip, who is also fat. And the movie really wants you to know that part. This ragtag crew is carrying out this elaborate attack on the high school for no discernible reason. I mean, I think the filmmakers probably think that there's a reason, but no. It really doesn't seem like they got around to writing that part. At one point, Tristan monologues at the town sheriff over the phone, and it reads like I asked ChatGPT to write me a Joker speech. He says something vague about how all of them are culpable because they post and they tweet, and how everyone online wants to be judge and jury, and how he's just the executioner. But that's really about all we get. And I sort of want to assume that this is supposed to be some kind of nod toward cancel culture, but it's honestly so vague that I don't even know. It's all frankly dumbfounding. Like, I guess it's okay if your character just does senseless violence for the sake of senseless violence, but don't spend the entire movie pretending that these characters represent some kind of real-life ideology. Of course, the movie does vaguely try to gesture that the attackers are somewhat left-leaning, but like, the script feels like this dude sat down and thought, I'm really gonna own the libs with this one, and then immediately realized that he had absolutely no idea what liberals believe. So instead of creating an ideology for these characters, he just suggests that these two guys are gay and trusts his audience will fill in the blanks. So yeah, that was kind of a tangent unrelated to mental health, but I think that's fine, because I can explain the film's characterization of the bad guy's mental health pretty quick. Again, the real through line with these guys is just how ill-defined they are, and that more than extends to the portrayal of their mental health. Alright, are you ready for the big reveal? Are you ready to hear the explanation of these guys' mental states? Here it comes. They're crazy. And that's about it. They've been bullied or something, which is not developed literally at all. Aside from this guy telling a story about getting pantsed in 6th grade, to which Zoe calls him fat, and then he dies. And that guy and this other guy both talk about hearing voices, ostensibly to make them seem more scary and unpredictable. It's infuriatingly underwhelming. These guys are like the royalty-free version of Columbine, and that's every bit as offensive as it sounds. So I want to conclude by talking about why I think the film is the way it is. Firstly, let's finish up our discussion of the antagonists. When I see these guys, when I take a step back and squint my eyes, what I realize is that they are the image in the heads of so many conservatives when they offer up mental health as an explanation for school shootings. They are boogeymen. They are one-dimensional, cartoonishly bad, sexually deviant crazies. And like so many real-life conservative pundits, the film also doesn't even begin to suggest a solution to the problem of mental illness. It is a talking point that begins and ends with asserting that the real problem is not lax gun laws, but rather mental illness. But the fantasy that this movie and so many conservative voices are trying to sell us is one in which these people don't really count as people. Their mental illness and their immorality go hand in hand. Why else are we coached to see them not only as mentally ill, but also hypersexual and possibly gay and vaguely left of center? All these coincidentally being social and political groups that the right largely already sees as less than human. They are, at best, one-dimensional, moving targets for the fabled good guy with a gun. The bad guys in Run, Hide, Fight and the bad guys we hear about on Fox News are one and the same figment of the right-wing imagination. They are ill-defined because the ideological group that is fabricating them doesn't meaningfully understand the group that they are caricaturing, and ultimately don't believe they are worth understanding. And I think Zoe is also a figment of the conservative unconscious, and also a harmful one. Zoe is a representation of the conservatives' ideal outcome for mental illness. She feels like an example of what they think a good and strong person does in the face of emotional struggle. She bottles it up and shoves it down. She develops callousness, and with it, self-sufficiency. Something that 60 years ago we might have called grit. but that we now know is an alienating and ineffective coping strategy. Honestly, while watching the film, I kept comparing her in my head to Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver. They're both emotionally troubled, socially alienated people. They both develop a type of callousness in response to past trauma, and that callousness leads both, eventually, to acts of violence which are ultimately deemed to be heroic. The difference is that Taxi Driver is haunting. Travis, a volatile, ticking time bomb of a man, spends the majority of the film planning a political assassination, and then, right before he goes through with it, he turns his rage to a human trafficking ring instead. He's celebrated as a hero for it, but we as the audience know that Travis wasn't doing this to do something good or heroic. Travis is a man full of deep, dark hatred for the world around him. And he just so happened to take that hatred out on the right people. It was entirely arbitrary. We know, when watching Taxi Driver, that Travis is a twisted, scarred, broken man who has tragically slipped through the cracks of the system and has been left to fester in its underbelly. It sounds weird, but Zoe is kind of the same. Full of rage and pain and just taking it out on the right people. The issue is, Run, Hide, Fight is entirely uncritical of this fact. In fact, it celebrates it. It tells us, no, this school shooting was actually a net good for Zoe. No, bottling your emotions and only knowing how to express them through acts of violence is a good thing. It's strength. And that is just simply a lie. People need openness, and they need vulnerability, and they need healthy, constructive ways of approaching trauma. And to bring this all full circle, before closing the video out, I feel it's very important to say that the perspective this film offers is decidedly nothing new. The good guys, the strong, morally pure guys, eat their emotions. The bad guys' emotions, insofar as they matter, are overly simple and indistinguishable from moral failings. So you need not feel guilt about not thinking on them any harder than that. And I'd like to wrap up on that point, because I think it's my ultimate point here. Run, Hide, Fight does not ask its audience to think deeply about any facet of its story or about the mentality that underlies that story. Rather, it tells the viewer that their traditional default beliefs, the beliefs most of the audience already held going into the film, are totally okay, and they need not think any harder about it.